The bundle of wet linen was heavy against her hip, and the coarse gray dress smelled of lye and other women's labor. And the two men at the door of the assembly hall did not so much as turn their heads as she passed between them with her eyes lowered and her basket balanced against the doorframe. They were watching for a lady. They had been told to watch for a slender young woman of 22, in mourning silk, pale and frightened, the sort of woman a crowd had come to see condemned. They were not watching for a laundress. So Rosalind Vane walked into the room in which she was to be tried for her life, and no one stopped her, and no one knew her, and for the length of 9 slow footsteps she was free, inside the very building meant to hold her. She had not slept. Her hands, chapped now from the work she had taken up in secret these past 3 weeks, did not shake. And this steadiness surprised her more than fear would have. Above the rows of benches the winter light came gray through tall windows, and the gentlemen of the county filled the front rows in their dark coats, and the women behind them held their fans still. And at the raised table sat the men who would decide whether she had murdered the man who raised her. She set the basket down against the wall, where the servants stood. She was, for this one held breath, only a pair of hands in a plain dress, invisible in the way the poor are always invisible, and she meant to use that invisibility to hear with her own ears the thing no one would say to her face. You may think you know how this story ends, because you have seen 100 rooms decide a woman's worth before she has spoken a word. Stay with me. This room was about to be wrong, in a way it did not yet suspect. 3 weeks earlier, on the morning after they buried Sir Alfred Combe, the household had still smelled of the sick room, of vinegar and burnt feathers and the tallow of the candles they had kept lit at his bed for 11 nights. Rosalind had been his ward since she was 9 years old, brought to Thornley after the fever took both her parents in a single fortnight, and Sir Alfred had been neither warm nor cruel to her, but something more useful than either, which was fair. He had taught her the accounts. He had let her read in his library, until the candles guttered. He had said, more than once in his dry way, that she had a better head for figures than the steward, and a better memory than the vicar, and that it was a pity the world had no use for either in a girl without a fortune. Now he was dead, and the world had found a use for her after all. It had decided she had killed him. The accusation came, dressed in the softest voice in the house. Lady Combe, the baronet's sister, who had come from Bath the week he first took ill and had settled into the best bedroom, as though she had been waiting years for the invitation, stood in the morning room with her black gloves folded over her wrist and said to the assembled servants that she did not wish to speak ill of anyone. That grief made people unwell, that it was a very great pity a young woman with no prospects should have been left so much and so long alone with a sick man and his medicine bottles. She did not say the word. She never once said the word. She only arranged the silence around it so that everyone in the room could see its shape. To the household, from that morning, Rosalind was the poisoner. No one said it to her. It was said in the pause when she entered the kitchen and the talk stopped. It was said in the way the second footman would not meet her eye. It was said 3 days later, and quite plainly, by Lady Combe herself, to the apothecary who came to collect his unpaid bill, in a voice pitched to carry down the passage where Rosalind stood with a tray in her hands. The ward, Lady Combe said, as though naming a species. One cannot prove it, of course, and yet we all of us know what we know. Rosalind set the tray down very carefully on the hall table so that not one cup should rattle, and she walked to the cold end of the corridor where no one went, and she stood there until she was sure her face would obey her again. That was the first lesson of those weeks. The body tells the truth. The mouth has been forbidden. Her hands had shaken. Then they did not shake now, in the assembly hall, and she understood the difference. 3 weeks ago she had been afraid of what they thought. Now she was only afraid of what they would do. The reason the accusation had teeth was money, as such reasons always are. Sir Alfred had died without a legitimate heir of his body, and his estate of Thornley some £4,000, and the house and the home farm would pass under the entail to a cousin in Yorkshire who had never seen it. There was, however, a second will, a later one, drawn up in the last year of his life, and this will left £300 and the contents of the library to his ward. In recognition, it said, of her care and her company. £300. It was not a fortune. It was, to a woman with nothing. The difference between service and a small independence, between being handed from household to household as an unpaid companion and having a room that could be locked from the inside. It was also in the hands of a clever woman who wished to be rid of her. Motive enough to hang. Lady Combe wished to be rid of her. Rosalind had understood this within a day of the woman's arrival, in the way one understands weather. Lady Combe had debts of her own in Bath. Debts she believed the estate ought to answer, and a ward with a claim on even £300 was £300. Lady Combe considered hers. If the ward were discredited, the later will might be set aside as the influence of a scheming girl on a dying man. If the ward were worse than discredited, if she were removed altogether, there would be no claimant at all. The arithmetic was not difficult. Rosalind had a better head for figures than the steward. She had done the sum herself, alone, in the cold end of the corridor, and had understood exactly how much her life was worth to the woman in the best bedroom. What she had not understood that first week was how quickly a whisper becomes a warrant. Lady Combe had a cousin who was a justice of the peace in the next parish, a heavy, comfortable man named Mr. Bice. Pettifer, who liked his dinners and disliked complication, and to Mr. Pettifer she had gone with her folded gloves and her soft voice, and her account of medicine bottles, and a girl left too much alone. The apothecary, who wanted his bill paid and knew who would pay it, remembered that Sir Alfred had worsened after taking a draught the ward had carried up. The cook, who feared for her place, remembered nothing that helped, and a great deal that did not, and so a coroner's inquest became a committal, and a committal became a date at the county sessions. And Rosalind, who had nursed a dying man through 11 nights and closed his eyes with her own hands, was bound over to stand trial for his murder. They should have kept her in the jail at the county town. That she was not there, that she was walking free through the streets in a borrowed gray dress, on the morning of her own trial, was the doing of a single person, and it is time you knew who he was. His name was Hugh Annesley, and he was the Earl of Marden, and he was the last man in the county anyone would have expected to trouble himself over a poisoner's ward. He had come to Thornley only because Mr. 2. Pettifer was his tenant and had asked him, as the senior magistrate of the district, to sit at the sessions and lend the bench the weight of his rank. Marden had not wanted to come. He had spent the 4 years since the war with his gates shut and his knocker down, a widower of 31, who rode out at dawn when the roads were empty and returned before the county was awake, and the neighborhood had long since stopped inviting him, and settled instead for calling him proud. He was not proud. He was a man who had learned, in a field hospital in Spain and in a house in this very county 18 months later, that there are some things a man cannot set right no matter how correctly he behaves, and he had decided that the safest course was to behave correctly and expect nothing. He had buried a wife. That much the county knew. What the county did not know was how she had died, and what he believed his own part in it had been, and why the sight of a person being judged on appearances made something in his chest go very cold and very still. He had gone to Thornley 2 days before the trial, to satisfy himself of the fact, as a conscientious magistrate should, and he had found instead a household organized around a conclusion. Everyone he spoke to had the same answer, ready before he finished the question. The apothecary was too eager. The cook was too frightened. And Lady Combe, receiving him in the best drawing-room with the fire built high, had made a single mistake that a less watchful man would have missed. She had called the dead man's ward, in the space of one careful speech, both a scheming little nobody who had wormed her way into a sick man's confidence and a poor, foolish creature who had not the wit to know what she did. A person is one thing or the other. She cannot be both the cunning schemer and the witless fool, not in the same breath, unless the person speaking does not care, which is true, so long as the girl is destroyed. Marden had sat in the high-backed chair with his gloves in his hand and his face still as ice over a river, and he had said nothing, and he had understood that he was being asked to lend his rank to a killing. He had asked to see the ward. Lady Combe had said it was not thought advisable. He had asked to see the second will, and the apothecary's original statement, and the dates of the drafts against the dates of the physician's own visits, and Lady Combe had grown, by very small degrees, less soft. And Marden, who in 4 years had wanted nothing, had found himself wanting one thing with a suddenness that unsettled him. He wanted the girl not to hang for the convenience of the woman by the fire. That is where matters stood on the eve of the trial. Rosalind, held not in the jail, after all, but in an upper room at the inn, under the eye of a bribable turnkey, because Mr. Ginchis, Pettifer had thought it kinder, and Lady Combe had thought it cheaper, and neither had thought her worth a proper guard. And Marden, who had spent that evening in his cold library reading and rereading a copy of the apothecary's statement and finding in it a hole he could put his whole hand through, and who had done a thing that night he could not afterward entirely explain to himself. He had sent his steward to the inn with a message for the prisoner, unsigned, in a hand not his own. It said only this: "They will not let you speak. Find a way to be in the room before they do." And folded inside it, though he told himself it was merely practical, was a laundress's gray working dress, because a woman marked for a poisoner cannot walk out of an inn as herself, but no one anywhere has ever looked twice at a woman carrying wet linen. She had not known who sent it. She had known only that someone with more power than she had decided she should be heard, and that she had one morning in which to make herself heard before a room that had already made up its mind. So she had put on the plain dress. She had filled a basket with the inn's washing. She had walked out past a turnkey who was looking for a frightened lady and saw only a drudge, and she had crossed the town in the gray light, and now she stood against the wall of the assembly hall among the servants and the poor, listening, while the men at the table sorted their papers and the county filed in to watch her, tried in her absence. She heard the clerk call her name. She heard the small stir when no prisoner answered it. She heard Mr. Sally, Pettifer from the table, say something testy about the turnkey and the inn, and she heard Lady Combe's voice from the front bench say clearly and with just the right note of pained patience, "She has run. Of course she has run. Guilt has legs, gentlemen. An innocent woman would be here." And Rosalind, from the back of the room in a laundress's plain dress, with her basket at her feet, and her chapped hands folded and her heart going like a hammer against her stays, understood that this was the moment. Not later. Not when they called for her defense, for they would never call for it. Now, while the trap of her absence was closing, while the woman by the fire was turning her flight into her confession. She thought of Sir Alfred, who had said she had a better head for figures than the steward. She thought of the 11 nights. She stepped away from the wall. "I am here," she said. The room turned. All of it, at once, the whole gray and black crowd of it, benches and fans and dark coats, turned toward the plain woman standing at the back with the laundry basket at her feet. And for a moment, no one understood, because they were looking for a lady in mourning silk and they saw a drudge. Then the understanding moved through the room like cold through a house, bench by bench, and the fans stopped. And Mr. Dawn, Pettifer half rose from his chair, and Lady Combe's face, which had been arranged so beautifully in patient sorrow, came apart at one corner of the mouth before she caught it. "I have not run," Rosalind said. Her voice was not loud. She had learned in 3 weeks of silence how to make a quiet thing carry. "I have walked in past your guards in a laundress's dress, because I was not to be permitted to walk in as myself. I am the woman you have come to try. I ask only what any of you would ask, that I be allowed to speak before you decide I am guilty of it." There was uproar, of course. There is always uproar, Mr. Gore. Pettifer struck the table and demanded to know how the prisoner came to be at large, and the turnkey was sent for, and Lady Combe rose to her full height and declared that this was precisely the sort of low cunning she had warned them of, that a respectable woman did not disguise herself as a servant and creep into a court of law, that it proved everything. And it might have carried. The room was tipping toward her, toward the polished, certain woman in the good black silk, and away from the drudge with the basket, when a single voice cut across all of it from the raised table, level and unhurried, and carrying the whole weight of a rank no one in that room outranked. Let her speak. Rosalind had not, until that moment, looked at the men at the table. She had not dared. Now she looked, and she saw at the end of the bench a man she did not know, a tall man, in a dark blue coat, with his gloves laid flat before him, and his face composed to a stillness she would later think of as the stillness of deep water, and she saw that he was looking at her not as the room looked at her, with hunger or with judgment, but with a steadiness that seemed to be waiting for something. The Earl of Marden did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said again, into the silence his rank had made, "The court will let her speak. A person accused may answer the accusation. That is not cunning. That is law." Lady Coombs sat down. She had no rank to set against his, and she knew to the inch how far her softness would carry, and where it would not, and it would not carry here.
La!
Rosalind, standing at the back of the room with the whole county between her and the table, understood that she had been given by a man she had never met the one thing she had needed and could not seize for herself, which was permission. She did not yet understand why. She thought perhaps he was only a fair man, and fair men were rare enough that she did not question the gift. What she felt and could not have named if her life depended on it, and her life did depend on a great many things that morning, was a warmth low in her chest at the sound of that level voice saying her flight was not her guilt. She looked at the stranger at the table. The stranger looked back. Neither of them looked away as quickly as they should have. They brought her forward. She left the basket against the wall, and she walked the length of the room in the laundress's gray dress with her chin level, past the front bench where Lady Coombs sat rigid, and she stood where the accused stood, and for the first time in 3 weeks she was permitted to answer. And because she had a better head for figures than the steward, she did not weep, and she did not protest her innocence, which any guilty woman may do. She asked instead to be given the apothecary's statement, and the dates. What followed took the better part of 2 hours, and I will not carry you through every page of it, though the room hung on every page. She read the apothecary's account aloud in her steady laundress's voice, and then she read the physician's own record which Marden had asked for, and which lay on the table because he had asked, and she set the two against each other the way she had once set the steward's accounts against the tradesmen's bills, and the whole opened in front of the whole county. The draft she was accused of carrying up on the night Sir Alfred worsened had been prescribed by the physician himself, in the physician's own record, in his own hand, 3 days before that night. The apothecary had sworn she carried up an unnamed draft on a night the physician's book showed the physician present in the house until midnight. The dates would not lie down together. One of them was false, and it was not the physician's book which had been written day by day for 11 nights, but the apothecary's statement, which had been written after the funeral, at Lady Coombs' table, for a bill that Lady Coombs had promised to pay. Rosalind did not say that last part. She had a better head than to say it. She only laid the dates side by side, and let the room do the sum, and the room, which had come to watch a poisoner hang, found itself doing arithmetic, and arithmetic is the enemy of a comfortable conclusion. Near the middle of that reading, in the pause, while a clerk was sent to fetch the physician himself from his house 2 streets away, Rosalind stood alone in the center of the room, with every eye upon her, and she was more tired than she had ever been in her life. And she let herself, for one moment, look again at the man at the end of the table. He had not moved. His gloves were still laid flat. She saw, though, that his hand had come to rest against the breast of his blue coat, over the pocket there, as though something were kept in it. And she saw that he was watching her with an expression she did not have the strength just then to interpret. And she felt the warmth again, unwelcome and steady. And she looked away first, because she could not afford it. She did not know his name. She would learn it within the hour. She did not yet know that he had sent the dress. The physician came. He was an honest man and an irritable one, and he did not like being fetched from his fire, and he liked even less being shown a sworn statement that contradicted his own careful book, and he said so, at length, in front of everyone. Sir Alfred Coombs, he said, had died of a disease of the heart that he had been treating for 2 years. That he had warned the family was mortal, and that no draught in his prescribing or out of it had hastened by an hour. He had said as much at the inquest, he added, and could not think why it had not been recorded, and he looked, when he said this, very hard at Mr. Pettifer, who looked at his papers. It was, by any measure, the end of the case. The dates were wrong. The physician was certain, and the only person in the room with a reason to want the ward discredited was sitting on the front bench in good black silk, with her hands very still in her lap. The law, however, is a slow animal, and a committal is not undone in an afternoon. And Mr. Pettifer, who wanted his dinner and dreaded his cousin, adjourned the sessions to the following morning, so that the physician's evidence might be properly taken, and the apothecary recalled, and he ordered the prisoner returned to the inn. Returned, this time under a proper guard. For the county had seen now that she was a woman who could walk through walls. They took her out through the side door into the grey afternoon, and it was there in the narrow yard between the assembly hall and the stables, with a constable at her elbow, that the Earl of Marden overtook her. Miss Vane? It was the first time in 3 weeks anyone had called her by her name and her title together, Miss Vane, as though she were a person of consequence, as though she were not the ward, not the poisoner, not the drudge. She turned. He stood a careful yard from her, hat in hand, and up close. He was younger than the grey afternoon had made him look, and his eyes were the color of smoke, and he was looking at her with the same waiting steadiness she had seen across the room. "You read the dates well," he said. "I had a good teacher," she said. "He is the man I am accused of killing." Something moved in his face at that, quickly, and was gone. "Eat something tonight," he said. "You have not eaten. Sit by the fire and eat something and sleep. Tomorrow will be worse before it is better, and you will need the strength." It was not a request. It was very nearly an order in the flat, level voice he used, and Rosalind, who had spent 3 weeks being spoken to as a thing, heard the command and bristled at it before she heard what was underneath it. She was tired, and she was frightened still, despite everything, and she was not accustomed to being cared for. And so she said, more sharply than she meant, "You need not concern yourself with my supper, my lord. You have already done more than a stranger ought." "I am not a stranger," he said. And then, as though he had said more than he intended, he stopped. He looked at the basket a servant was carrying past them, the inn's laundry basket, her basket, and he looked back at her, and she understood, all at once, standing in the cold yard, exactly who had sent the grey dress and the unsigned note. Find a way to be in the room before they do. She understood that this man, this earl she had never met, had reached into her ruin 2 nights ago, and handed her the one tool that could save her, and had told no one, and had then sat at the table and made the room let her speak, and was now telling her to eat her supper as though her life were a thing he had decided to keep. She did not know what to do with it. No one had wanted her to live, not for herself in a very long time. Her eyes stung, and she was furious at them for it, and she said, in a much smaller voice, "Why?" He did not answer. "That." He put his hat back on his head. "Tomorrow," he said, when they recalled the apothecary, "ask him who paid his bill. Ask him the date. Then let the room do the sum." He inclined his head. Precisely. The exact courtesy owed to a lady of consequence, and he walked back toward the hall, and Rosalind stood in the yard with the constable shifting at her elbow and watched the straight blue back of him until the door closed behind it. That night at the inn she ate. She did not know entirely why, except that a man with smoke-colored eyes had told her to, and that his voice, when it dropped, had had something in it that was not command at all. Here's a thing I want you to hold on to, wherever you are listening from tonight. The world had told Rosalind, in 100 quiet ways, that her life was a sum in someone else's ledger, a figure to be crossed out for convenience. And a man who had shut his own gates against the world for 4 years had looked at that sum and decided it was wrong. That is all recognition is, someone doing the arithmetic and refusing the comfortable answer. Why did he do it? The answer lay in the pocket of the blue coat over his heart, and it had a name, and the name was Cecily. 18 months before he ever rode to Thornley, the Earl of Marden had come home from the war to a wife he had married in haste before he sailed, a gentle, laughing girl he had known for 6 weeks and loved for the rest of his short marriage. The physicians could not agree. One said her lungs, one said her nerves, one said a wasting of no clear cause. And into the confusion had come a cousin of hers, a plausible, attentive man, who had taken charge of the sick room while Martin, newly returned and half a stranger to his own house, had deferred. He had deferred because he did not know his wife's people, because the cousin spoke with confidence and he with none, because a man fresh from a field hospital doubts his own judgment about the living. And Cecily had grown worse under the cousin's care, and had died, and it was only after going through the accounts as a widower must that Martin had found the cousin's debts, and the codicil the cousin had urged, and had understood too late and without any proof that would stand. That his gentle wife had very likely been helped out of the world by a man he had let hold her medicine. He had never proven it. The cousin had gone abroad. There was no ledger of dates to lay side by side, no physician's honest book, nothing but a widower's certainty, and a grief that had no place to go. And so he had shut his gates, and ridden out at dawn, and carried in the pocket of his coat, over his heart, a miniature of a laughing girl and a single folded page in her hand. And he had told himself that the lesson of his life was that a man who trusts appearances and defers to confidence. He carried the failure the way other men carry a watch. Then he had walked into a house at Thornley, and seen it happening again. A gentle person judged by appearances, condemned by a plausible relative with debts, and a room full of comfortable men prepared to defer. Only this time, he was not a stranger fresh from the war doubting his own eyes. This time he was the senior magistrate of the district, and he had rank, and he had learned the exact shape of the thing, and there was still time. That was why he had sent the dress. Not because he had in 2 days fallen in love with a woman he had glimpsed only in an apothecary's lying statement. He was not a boy. It was because Rosalind, in her ruin, was Cecily given back to him with the clock turned back, and he had sworn in the cold of his shut-house that if he were ever given the hour again, he would not defer, he would not be silent, he would not let the plausible win. What he had not counted on, riding to that trial with his old grief for armor, was that Rosalind would not need saving so much as witnessing, that she would read the dates herself in a laundress's steady voice, and lay them side by side with her own chapped hands, and turn the room by her own courage, while he did no more than hold the door of speech open for her. He had come to rescue Cecily. He had found instead a woman who rescued herself and needed only that one man in 100 should refuse to look away. And somewhere in the long 2 hours of that first day, watching her do with her mind the thing he had failed to do with his, the old grief in the pocket of his coat had shifted and made room and let in something he had 4 years ago decided he would never feel again, and did not know yet what to call. The second morning of the sessions was clear and very cold, and the assembly hall was fuller than the first, for word had gone through the county overnight that the poisoner's ward had walked through the guards in a servant's dress, and read the dates like a clerk, and made the physician contradict the sworn statement, which loves nothing so much as a reversal, had come to see the rest. Rosalind was brought in through the front door this time, under guard but through the front, in her own mourning dress, which the inn's people had brushed and pressed for her without being asked, a small kindness she noticed and would not forget. She saw, as she came in, that the plain gray laundress's dress had been folded and laid on the bench where she had left the basket the day before, folded neatly by some hand, and she did not know whose. She would keep that dress all her life. It had carried her past the guards. It had, though she did not yet frame it so, carried her back into the world of the living. The apothecary was recalled. He was a thin, sweating man who had not slept either, and he did not do well. Rosalind, permitted now to question him, did exactly as the level voice in the yard had told her. She did not accuse. No. She asked him who had settled his account with the estate. She asked him the date it had been settled. She asked him gently in her steady voice whether it was before or after he had given his sworn statement, and the thin man looked at the front bench, at the woman in good black silk, and the whole room followed his eyes. And Lady Combe, for the first time, did not have her face ready. The apothecary said the bill had been settled the week before the inquest. Settled by Lady Combe. Rosalind said nothing at all. She only stepped back and let the room do the sum, and the room did it, and the sum came out to a woman by the fire who had bought a dying man's ward to place at the end of a rope. It came apart quickly after that. The physician's book was read into the record. The dates were laid before the bench. Mr. Pettifer, who wanted above all else for this to be over, and for his own name not to be in it, found that the simplest way to be rid of the whole affair was to declare, as the physician's evidence plainly showed, that Sir Alfred Combe had died of the disease of the heart he had long suffered, that no crime had been committed by any person, and that the prisoner was discharged without a stain. He said it fast, and he did not look at his cousin when he said it. And Lady Combe, who had come to that room to watch a rival crossed out of a ledger, rose from the front bench into a silence that had turned entirely against her. I want you to notice what did not happen here, because it is the mark of the kind of story this is. No one dragged Lady Combe from the room. No constable took her arm. She was not made to weep or beg. The county did not need to destroy her. It only needed to see her, clearly, for the first time, and it did, and its seeing was punishment enough. The men who had bowed to her the week before found somewhere else to look. The women who had envied her bath gowns discovered they had letters to write. She had traded on the county's belief that she was a respectable woman wronged by a scheming girl, and the county had just watched the scheming girl read the truth off a page, while the respectable woman bought perjury by the week, and there was no gown in Bath that would buy that back. She left Thornley within the month. The debts followed her. The estate, under the entail, went to the cousin in Yorkshire, who proved a decent enough man, and confirmed the second will without argument, so that Rosalind had her £300 and the library after all. That, though, is running ahead, because on that second morning when Mr. Pettifer said the words that gave Rosalind her life back, discharged without a stain, the room did not erupt. It exhaled. And into that long exhale, before the crowd could gather itself into noise, the Earl of Marden rose from the end of the table. He had spent 4 years learning the cost of the words a man does not say, and he was not now going to bury the moment under the words a man says too many of. He came down from the raised table, past the front bench where Lady Combe stood forgotten, and he crossed the length of the assembly hall in the sight of the whole county, in no hurry at all, until he stood in front of the woman he had first seen in a laundress's grey dress. The room, which a moment before had been ready to cheer a reversal, went entirely still, because the county understood before Rosalind did what it was watching. An earl does not cross a public room to a discharged prisoner without meaning to be seen doing it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he offered her his arm. "Miss Vane," he said in the level voice, so that it carried to the last bench. "Will you allow me to see you home?" It was not a question. It was 8 words, and it was the most costly thing a man of his rank could say in that room, because it was a public claiming, witnessed by every gossip in the county, of a woman just accused of murder, and it could not be unsaid, and he meant it to be unable to be unsaid. He had learned at the price of a gentle laughing girl what silence costs. He was not going to be silent now. Rosalind looked at the offered arm. She looked at his face, at the smoke-colored eyes that were, for the first time, not composed to stillness at all, but open, waiting, uncertain, in a way that undid her more than any certainty could have. She was aware of the whole county watching. She was aware of the folded grey dress on the bench, of the 11 nights, of Sir Alfred saying she had a better head than the steward, of 3 weeks in which not one soul had wanted her to live for her own sake. And she understood that this man was not offering her rescue, for she had rescued herself, and he knew it. He was offering her the thing that came after rescue, which was to be chosen, in daylight, by name, in front of the very room that had gathered to condemn her. "You are a stranger, my lord," she said. She was not sharp now, though. There was something almost like the beginning of a smile in it, the first in 3 weeks, and he heard it, and something eased in his face. "I am not a stranger," he said again, low, only for her this time, though the room strained to hear it. "I sent the dress." "I know," she said. "I have known since the yard." paw, ha, paw. And she put her chapped hand, which had read the dates, and turned the room and shaken only once in 3 weeks, upon the blue sleeve of his coat. Over the arm he offered, and the county saw her do it, and the long exhale of the room became at last a sound, though what kind of sound Rosalind never afterward could say, for she was not listening to the room. She was walking the length of the assembly hall on the arm of the Earl of Marden, past the guards who had not known her the day before, out through the front door into the clear, cold light, and she was, for the first time in her life that she could remember, being taken home by someone who had decided she was worth keeping. The spring came late that year to the county, and when it came all at once, the hedges greening in a week, and the home farm's orchard breaking into blossom. And by then, a great deal had settled into place. Rosalind had not gone to the cousin in Yorkshire, nor into service as a companion in some cold house, nor even to the small independence of her £300 and a room that locked from the inside, though she had been careful in those first weeks to make sure she could have chosen any of them. She had wanted it understood, by herself most of all, that when she gave her hand, it was a gift and not a rescue. Marden had understood. He had courted her slowly, correctly, in the sight of the county, in the drawing-room of his no longer shut house with the knocker up again and the fires lit, and the county, which had watched him claim her in the assembly hall, watched now with the sentimental attention it gave to nothing else, and pronounced them, in the end, a very fine thing. On an evening in that late spring, the two of them sat in the library at Marden that had been dark for 4 years, and was dark no longer. The fire low and warm, the long windows open to the blue dusk and the smell of the orchard coming in. She had been reading to him. She read to him most evenings now from the library, that had been Sir Alfred's and had come to her under the second will and had followed her here, book by book, so that the dead man who had taught her the accounts had a shelf in the house of the man who had refused to let her be crossed out. Marden lay back in his chair, with his eyes half closed, and Rosalind read, and the fire settled, and after a while she stopped, and he opened his eyes to see why. She was holding, not the book, but a small thing she had taken from the pocket of his coat, where it lay across the chair arm, the thing he carried over his heart. She held it now with great gentleness, the miniature of a laughing girl and the single folded page, in a hand not her own, and she looked at him across the firelight with no jealousy in her face at all, only a grave tenderness, because she had understood a long time ago whose failure had bought her life. "You will keep her," Rosalind said. It was not a question, in the pocket, over your heart. You will keep her there always, and I would think less of you if you did not. Marden looked at the woman in the firelight who had walked through the guards at her own trial in a laundress's plain dress, and who had read the dates that saved her with her own chapped hands, and who now held his oldest grief without flinching, and told him to keep it. And he found that the thing he had not been able to name in the assembly hall had a name after all, and had had one for some time. "I sent you the dress," he said, "because I could not save her. I need you to know that it began. As her—" "I know," Rosalind said. "You told me, without telling me, in the yard." She folded the miniature closed, and set it back herself, into the pocket of the blue coat, over his heart where it belonged. "It began as her. It is not her now." "No," he said. "No, it is not." Outside the long windows the last light went out of the orchard, and somewhere below a servant was closing the house for the night, and the fire settled again in the grate of the library that had been dark, and was warm now, and Rosalind, who was not going to be Rosalind Vane very much longer, took up the book again from where she had left it, and found her place. On the bench of the great hall of that house, folded and kept, was a laundress's plain gray dress that no one would ever wash again, because it had carried her past the guards, and into the room and into the one life, of all the lives she might have been handed, that she had been permitted to choose. She read on into the blue dark, and he listened, and neither of them looked away. "Thank you for staying with them until the end. If Rosalind's walk through those guards moved you, stay a moment and tell me the moment you felt the room turn, and I will meet you here again by another fire with another story worth the staying.